All right, look, I've teased that we were going to hit this particular motif in Matthew chapter 28 for like 2 or 3 days. We got a few things swirling around here right now, imagery-wise, as we are at the very end of the book of Matthew, having worked through it together, one little chunk at a time, for over 3 years. And we've got a lot of imagery that is present. There's a lot to soak in with just a few words here in this final scene. Imagery number one that we've been talking about is the imagery of commissioning. Yesterday I was talking about the Lion King and little Simba getting a 3-part commissioning from his father, Mufasa, the third of which comes from beyond the grave, stressing to Simba, who has all kinds of doubt about himself, about his relationship with his father, about the kingdom, about everything. Mufasa is stressing to him, go and take your place and do the stuff that you need to do. And he even gives him this assurance that somehow the kings of the past, that somehow Mufasa is going to be there in support of him. Well, a similar assurance is something we're about to see here in Matthew chapter 28 in the third part of a 3-part, maybe you can argue that it's even a larger multi-part commissioning that we're getting from Jesus, but this is going to be the final restoration and commissioning. And it's happening in a place that is associated with these kind of deep, meaningful conversations throughout the book of Matthew and really throughout the whole Bible. You go up on the mountain to get the profound stuff of God, and that is the case here. Again, you kind of get some Lion King overtones, or the Lion King has some Bible overtones, I should say, and that part of the commissioning that Mufasa gives to Simba is up in a high place where he can take stock of the whole thing and think about the scale and the grandeur of it, be intimidated by it, but also be struck by it and excited by it. And so here we are up on some mountain, and 2 conversations ago, I was like, wow, we got to talk. How'd they get there? What mountain? How did they know? Look, I assume this is a place that they had in common and that everybody would wink, wink, nod, nod, no. If we were going to get back together, this would be where it's going to happen. But the language is interesting here for a minute, and I think it merits a bit of a detour. It says, then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. Okay, so are we saying here that Jesus told them to go to Galilee, or is there specifically a mountain? At least this translation, I'm more inclined to read it as though he told them specifically to go to a mountain. So did Matthew screw up here? What gives? I mean, it looks like Matthew 28 is just the women, they go to the tomb, and then the angels there, and the guards, they're like fainting goats. And Jesus appears to the women. He's like, go tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. Does the angel tell them where to go in Galilee? Nope, just says into Galilee. Then we get the aside about the conspiracy to cover things up, and then we're here. So I don't know where this fits, right? It doesn't seem to. However, if you go and you look at the other stuff from the other Gospels, we discover that Jesus has appeared to the disciples in Jerusalem and at other times here before they make their way all the way back up to Galilee, which is a pretty long hike. It looks like a little bit of time passed to maybe let things settle down a little bit, or maybe just travel preparations. But John gives us an accounting of Jesus' appearances in Jerusalem. We've got one situation where the disciples are gathered in a place and the doors are all locked, and Jesus just comes in, shows up, and says, peace be with you, and then initiates the process of imparting to them the Holy Spirit, something that we see take physical form in Acts chapter 2, a few pages later. And then after that, we see an encounter with Thomas, which it says about a week later. And so presumably we're still in that same house. We're still in Jerusalem at this point. And that's where you get the doubting thing with Thomas. Now, as we talked about yesterday, when in verse 17 in Matthew 28, when it says, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. I don't think that's just a nod to Thomas. I think more than Thomas was doubting there. And a lot of times when Matthew uses this kind of vague language about disciples and who thought what and who felt what, I get the impression, I can't prove it, but I get the impression that's when he wants to acknowledge his own emotions as an eyewitness. And I think that's what's happening here. I think Matthew, in some form, like we were talking about yesterday, doubted in this particular situation. It's pretty difficult to establish a doubt timeline with anyone because doubt is a very natural part of faith. doubt is a key part of the process of faith. Not everyone does the doubt thing, but I think many or most, at least in my era, in my moment in the world, we do. God doesn't seem to be terribly threatened by it. Jesus doesn't seem to be terribly threatened by it. He just moves forward with what he's going to do. Well, then in John chapter 21, the timeline takes us to Galilee. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. Sea of Tiberias is, it's obviously a renaming of the Sea of Galilee that was for the emperor at the time. So when these events were happening, that sea had been freshly renamed. By the time old man John writes this down, maybe it had been called the Sea of Tiberias for a bit longer. One of the questions I still have is, what mountain are we talking about here? Because I think there are a few that could make sense, and that theme of mountain and mountaintop experiences has come up a lot throughout the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 4, don't they go up on a mountain during the temptation? Yeah. Verse 8, again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. That kind of sounds like Mufasa and Simba as well, except here the devil is trying to tempt the one he took up on the mountain to respond wrongly to the kingdom and to be tempted by what he could get out of it. Whereas when Jesus takes the disciples up on the mountain here at the end, or when Mufasa talks to Simba, they're trying to say, look at the scope of this kingdom. I mean, it's kind of that, look at the fields, they're ready for harvest. Somebody's got to do something. It's you. Assume the right position, take your role in this kingdom and go and do it the right way. So we've got that mountaintop sequence, and then obviously just right here, opposite page, the Sermon on the Mount. Probably Alia thought of that one. Where is that? I think it's probably just north and a little bit west of Capernaum. So on the north-ish side of the Sea of Galilee, a little bit on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. There's a church there called the Church of the Beatitudes. There's really no better candidate for a historical tradition for where the Sermon on the Mount took place. And that gives you a really good look at all of Galilee and the surrounding countryside. It would make sense that Jesus would take them up there to get a good look at everything, and also to overlook the place where they had been fishers of fish. I mean, you can see the whole Sea of Galilee from right there, and to talk about becoming fishers of men. So I think that's a pretty good candidate, but we're still looking at different places where mountains come up. In chapter 14, Jesus goes up on a mountain after getting the news of John the Baptist's execution. I kind of picture that being on that same northern slope, northern face of the Sea of Galilee, just given the fact that he could see that there was trouble on the Sea of Galilee while that was going on. I think the feeding of the 5,000 is not specified as being on a mountain, but I think the feeding of the 4,000 is specified as being on a mountain. And then obviously the transfiguration in chapter 17 seems like it would be a good candidate. And then I guess you get the reference to the Mount of Olives, but obviously they're not back in Jerusalem. They're up in Galilee. So what's the most likely place that they're getting together, given what Jesus is trying to accomplish here? Well, the Mount of Transfiguration, if that is the one that history says it is Mount Tabor, and that is not close by. That's a pretty good hike back toward Nazareth. It looks like an island in the middle of a sea. It's a very interesting geologic formation, but way out of the way. So I don't think they probably went there. And there isn't really another iconic mountain around the Sea of Galilee where a lot of stories happened or anything. I mean, you heard me just go through the list. So I assume they're back at the place where Jesus laid out what the kingdom was for the first time publicly. I assume they're back at the place where they can see the Sea of Galilee. They can see from the Mount of the Beatitudes, the little town where most of them grew up and worked out of, and they can contrast this little life and this little world and this little thing that they were doing, noble though it might have been in its simplicity, with the gigantic perspective that Jesus is wanting them to take on now. Even though we obviously think of that quaint little village and the fishing life that they lived as being, again, noble and quaint and peaceful, it was also representative in their life of just the world system. Eat, drink, sleep, love, work, die. versus the values that were represented by where they were sitting, if indeed they were in the location of the Sermon on the Mount, which were the kingdom values, the Beatitudes, all of those blessed are statements, all of that purpose, all of that challenge not to worry and to do things in terms of spiritual disciplines that demonstrate a right understanding of God's character and the values of the kingdom, to do things in relation to others that demonstrate those same values, and then to give away those things. You can't hide the light of that city on a hill. And indeed, it looks like Jesus is saying that that light that was introduced maybe here in this exact same spot back in the Sermon on the Mount, that it's going to emanate, that it's going to radiate from there. And these guys with their doubt and their poor decision-making and their humiliation from stuff they know they got wrong, Jesus is putting an affirming hand on their back and saying, brothers, here's what we do next. If all of this just happened on some mountain, I still think it's evocative of a new Sinai, Moses and the Ten Commandments going to a high place to get perspective. But if it happened on the Mount of the Beatitudes, I think it's even more loaded. And so it's fun for me to imagine that that is where it occurred. And I can't think of a better candidate that they all would have known or held in common that they would have gone to. One last thing. I continue to be grateful to Samaritan Ministries for sponsoring this podcast for this little stretch. Samaritan Ministries is a community of Christians who comes together to help pay each other's medical bills without the use of insurance. I think this is a genius, constructive proposal to solve the problems that come with trying to figure out how to pay for healthcare and get the healthcare you want in my country. And I love that that solution is one that is born out of volunteerism and compassion toward each other without any compulsion toward anyone else. It's a fantastic personal responsibility solution to these issues that face all of us. The way it works is super simple. You have some kind of incident or you need any kind of healthcare, you go and get it. You submit that to Samaritan. Samaritan contacts other members of the community who then send you money directly. So your medical bills end up being paid directly by other people. And when you send your share out every month, you're just doing the same thing for somebody else. I dig the philosophy behind this. I dig the values behind this. And I super appreciate how well it's worked for my family. If you want to learn more, you can go to SamaritanMinistries.org/TMBH, SamaritanMinistries.org/TMBH. Thanks for thinking about that, and thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.